Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our fourth session of Deconstructing Racism. I'm Nancy Gagne. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Coalition on Race. I'm excited to be back together with all of you again today. We're going to have our second session with presenter Kristen Lisanti on white supremacy, a deep dive into what that means and what we can do about it. What it has to do with racism, and we'll do some work on unconscious bias and how to deal with our own biases, and have some discussions and develop some action steps. Before I turn it over, I just want to remind people about some other upcoming events. The coalition's been very busy. Today we had a second event, a second session organized, orchestrated, and led by Durand Henhouse on that was a carryover from Black History Month, another session on African American genealogy, and I'm excited to hear about how that one went today. We
Overflow crowd.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
That's great news. It's great to hear the deep interest in our community, and what a service to provide. We have upcoming this week, if you know friends or neighbors with young children who are interested in learning more about the district's preschool program, we will have the leader of that program, Leroy Johnson, speaking on March 28th. Check our website, communitycoalitiononrace.org, for details about that. And I know there's something, integrated art circles. The opera session for April is filling up, but there's still room, so please sign up for that and check out the other art circles coming up throughout the rest of the year. On May 16th, we have Conversations on Race. We'll give you more details about that. And in late April, Talking to Children about Race. So many, many wonderful opportunities to learn more and be in community with people in Maplewood and South Orange and surrounding towns. And with that, I turn it over to our session leader.
Hi, I'm Barbara Velasquez. I'm the chair of the Anti-Racism Committee for the Coalition on Race. Welcome back, everyone. I'm just going to be, I really want to remind everybody that our session that was scheduled originally for April 9th has been moved to next week. So it will be a week from now. And please do put that on your calendars. Deconstructing racism, and I'm going through this just in case we have some new people here or a different cohort of people that have been here over the various weeks. So deconstructing racism explores how our society is infused by racist conditions and systems that impact us all behaviorally, psychologically, as well as what we can do about it. We want to address the forces of white supremacy who rely on our ignorance and to perpetuate their racist schemes, to, among other things, rewrite our history and deny and refuse accountability for the trauma caused by hatred, selfishness, and greed. Let me just briefly introduce the members of the Anti-Racism Committee who developed this presentation on deconstructing racism. Please raise your hand when I call your name. Committee members. Well, Mickey Murphy is not with us today. However, you'll remember that she presented on our initial month in white supremacist culture. Kristen Lisanti, who will be presenting the second half of her program on how it is white supremacy is maintained and upheld. Next week, I will start my presentation on the impact on people of color of white supremacy and the outcome of it to us all, including the nation and people of color. Now, Judith Gaston will follow up in May on what can be done to disrupt racism. And I also want to call out Judy Bernstein. I'm not sure if she's here, but she contributed also to the committee's work. We're going to be providing many opportunities for questions and discussions. So let us assume everyone here has a positive mindset and is ready to learn. If bias shows itself, during our discussions, and we all have biases, please regard it as your personal gifted opportunity to grow. Let us all agree to respond to that person or persons with both love and wisdom in the same way we would like to be treated. Okay, now I am going to turn this over to Kristen. I believe that's the person. There's no one in between. Kristen, please begin.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. I'm going to put us up into screen share and slideshow mode. Okay, and it looks like I'm sharing and invite my friend Judith Gaston to share with us our group agreements.
Hello, everyone. Here is our shared agreement. The first principle we use says show up all in, be present, and put away distractions. Second says listen to learn. Everyone has wisdom to share. Take space and make space is our third. We balance our speaking and listening. We'd like everyone to get a chance to also share what they've learned in their experiences. So we're asking you to not only share yours, but allow others to also get a chance to express themselves. We're staying local. We're speaking from direct experience. We refrain from giving advice. That's important. Respect is also a principle that we apply. Everyone's experience is valued as we go on throughout our discussions. Those are all very important principles that we try to apply as much as we can. Expect and allow discomfort. It does happen. We are here to learn. So even when biases show up, as Barbara said earlier, we know that it's okay. Learning does happen, definitely here. We attend to the body, presence or absence of feelings and sensations inform us. So we allow ourselves to physically feel certain emotions and at times share what they are. Confidentiality, we share the insight, but not the source. We respect others enough to not necessarily name anyone, though we may go ahead and divulge what we know and what was said. We stay with racism. We acknowledge that there are many isms. We have particularly chosen to focus on racism. There are no quick fix, and we acknowledge this. We are aware that change definitely takes time. With that, I am now going to ask Kristen to go ahead and begin.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, everyone, for creating this safe space for this work. Okay, so in part 2 of this series on deconstructing racism, we are exploring the system of white supremacy, how it works, and how it perpetuates itself through its 4 dimensions. So last week, we focused on the institutional and structural components of the system. Today, we're going to talk about how the system works within us, how we have internalized it, and how it shows up interpersonally in our relationships. I'd like to start by revisiting the metaphor of the stream that we started with last time. After describing racism and white supremacy as the stream that we're all swimming in, Dr. Robert Livingston says, anti-racism is about being the salmon that swims against the current and makes it upstream to the pristine headwaters to spawn. It's a metaphor for producing positive outcomes for the species, but it requires a lot of effort. In fact, only a small percentage of salmon ever make it upstream. So as Judith reminded us in our group agreements, and as we're going to unpack it more today, there is a lot of discomfort, there is a lot of effort, there is a lot of work involved in dismantling white supremacy. And we start here. So we'd like to have a check-in just for 10 minutes or so. We'll break into small groups. Audrey is hard at work building those groups for us now to ensure they'll be as racially diverse as possible. So we'll wait until she gives us the green light. But in the meantime, you can prepare by getting ready to share your name, your pronouns, your racial identity, and this question as a thought starter. How might this system of white supremacy operate within us? And you might consider that question as an individual, or how you see the system operating within us relationally and in community with one another. How might this system operate within us? There's no right answer to that question. This is just a reflection question. We'll be digging into a lot of content around this today. So Audrey, how are we doing with breakout groups for this first check-in?
We're doing excellent. And as a matter of fact, we're getting ready to launch your rooms. There will be 5 or 6 of you in each of the sessions. If anyone enters while you're in progress, we will add them. So if we are ready, you'll now, if you see a button that says join, please click that button. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Audrey. Okay. See you soon. Welcome back, everyone. So before we jump in to our content for today, we in our breakout group, we're having a conversation that just got cut off, and Clyde had invoked the racial slur that was on one of the bathroom walls, I think, at Marshall Elementary in January. And he had asked us how many of the people in our breakout group were aware that that happened. And then we were wondering, let's take this to the full group, Clyde suggested. So I'll just ask for a show of hands, just interesting to know who was aware that that happened when it happened. I'm seeing, the coalition members certainly raising their hands. I was aware not through, I have an elementary school age child, but I was made aware through friends and not any official communications channels or administrators channels. But it sounds like maybe outside the coalition, there is not much awareness. Okay.
I didn't see it in any of the local media, news media, such as they are.
Yeah. Thank you, Clyde, for that prompt. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
I'm sorry, what happened?
Does someone have an official line on the story? Like I said, my information was secondhand and through community members. Clyde, do you mind offering your, oh, you're on mute, my friend.
From an unofficial grandparent's information that was disseminated to me sometime in January. The N word was placed on the bathroom wall in the school. The parents were asked to do a Zoom last week, a week before last. None of them knew anything about it. Okay, so now the state of New Jersey has a protocol as to how anytime a word, regardless of whether it's Jewish or a Nazi symbol, any kind of hate kind of symbol that's received as a message to the person that looks at it, not the person who wrote it, they're supposed to report it to the police department. That didn't take place. And so my question to the group is, so we're talking about how do we disseminate and deconstruct racism? From my particular perspective is, and my grandmother always said that you put a light on it, you don't hide it. And so once again, my question to the group, how many people knew about this? And if it was a different group, if it was the Jewish community that this happened to, would it have been handled differently? And I'm not comparing the two, because pain and trauma to kids is pain and trauma. But if we're going to be honest here, let's have that discussion. Because in my opinion, I think that it was handled differently than it would be if it was been another race or another group. That's my opinion, and that's my opinion.
Thank you, Clyde, for helping us keep this local too, right? And remember that we're not talking theoretically about issues, even when we're talking about and addressing the systems level, that it's right here. It's right here at home.
Excuse me again. So how was it handled? What did they do when they called the police in?
Sounds like they might not have called the police. I'm not sure if a
Nothing.
coalition member happens to know.
Oh, they did
Nothing.
nothing. Okay.
No, this
Nothing
is-
has taken place. Nothing. Nothing has taken place like it normally does when that takes place. Nothing.
Okay.
May I suggest that we do a little bit of homework and see what we can find out and continue on our discussion today? It's very important, as you say, to shine a light on it, Clyde. But I think you brought it to all of our attention, and we'll do a little homework and report back to the group at the next session.
Yeah, Audrey, that's appropriate because this is not the. I think we should get the information. There's more information out there, and I'll just leave it at that.
Yes.
I'll leave it at that. It's not that nothing. I don't want to be put in this position, given my view on the district, but let's just get the information and then we can provide it because there's more to the story, and the coalition has been involved. I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Thank you. Back to you, Kristen.
Thank you. Okay, very good. Going back into screen share mode. All right. So this slide will look familiar to anyone who was here with us last week. Last time we explored not only a bit more of the history behind the system of white supremacy, but also the policies and practices that have been institutionalized in our society in just a couple of those pillars that we explored last time. This week, we're going to talk about those more internal factors that you see on the left side of the system diagram here, the priming, the associations, and the assumptions that really exist in our system, both individually and culturally. So the first half of our session today is going to be about the culture, the water that we swim in, using the stream analogy, but the culture that we live in. Culture being defined as the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of any group or community, town, state, nation. And we're going to be exploring the notion or the concept of white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture is a concept that primarily, but not exclusively, comes to us from a person named Tima Okun, who wrote an article back in 1999 that has grown and evolved over time. It's considered fairly controversial from a mainstream perspective, but we find that it holds a lot of really interesting and useful insights into understanding something that someone in my group said when we were checking in around how it can be so hard to see because it's everywhere. So we're going to try to tease apart some of the characteristics of this culture. And Tima Okun, in her introduction to white supremacy culture, which is now a website, we will share the website with everyone because it has a tremendous wealth of really rich, nuanced information there for us to explore. She says, white supremacy culture is the widespread ideology baked into our beliefs, values, norms, and standards, teaching us both overtly and covertly, as we saw last time. That's how the system works, obviously, and under the radar, that whiteness is what holds value, and that Blackness is not only valueless, but also dangerous and or threatening. So the thinking is that because this is the water we swim in, we inevitably internalize these messages. We absorb them, and that can shape how we think and act and make decisions. So white supremacy culture has been defined by some of these characteristics, which we're going to go through together now. The idea being that we're all subject to this culture and may have internalized them to some extent. I think also it can be useful to look at these characteristics and think about some of the communities or organizations that we are a part of and how this culture might show up in those contexts. My big disclaimer here is that this is one way of understanding white supremacy and its impact on the culture. This is not necessarily the way. We are going to be going through this quickly, which I think is a disservice, honestly, to the content, because really this is a deeply complex system, as I think we'll see. And so I encourage us to think about this as a tool for reflection, exploration, as an entry point, rather than something that's summarizing on everything in an easily understandable way. This is a complex system, and we want to make sure that we honor that. The other thing that this list, since it was originally introduced in 1999, it has been weaponized in some ways. People will use it to judge others in terms of, oh, I see you displaying this aspect of white supremacy culture. We really want to try not to do that. We want to try to own our parts in this. We want to try to see the system at work within ourselves and within our relationships. But again, as Judith so beautifully stated, and Barbara as well, in the intro, engage from a place of love, understanding, care, and wisdom. Okay, so moving into the characteristics of white supremacy culture. And by the way, we will have a breakout group on the other side of this overview. So be thinking about which of these characteristics really resonate with you, which of these feel like, oh yeah, that one I see clearly in my life or in my work. And we'll start with fear. The fear cultivated by white supremacy culture, it's really vital to the perpetuation of white supremacy in our culture. And what I found interesting in researching this is that it is really seated in the fear of not belonging or not being good enough. And then it from there grows into fear of others, particularly those that we might see as other from us. And on the website, White Supremacy Culture, Tima Oken and her colleagues talk about those who have left white nationalist groups point to belonging being the primary driver for why they joined in the first place. They say it never actually starts out with the ideology of white supremacy. That's not the beginning. It's about taking somebody who already feels isolated or making someone feel isolated and then inviting them into white supremacy as an identity that is good enough, that feels powerful, that connects them to others like them. And this may explain a bit why our rational or moral arguments against white supremacy are less successful than we expect they would be. We can't reason with that deep fear, loneliness, insecurity when it's being fed from this system. But what might be possible when we can offer belonging as well, when we can offer a sense of that safety as well, is a question we can grapple with. Each of these characteristics of white supremacy, with each of them is offered some antidotes. So antidotes to fear. When fear arises within us, we can name it and we can engage with practices for sitting with it, being with our fear, meditation, silence, music, art, in order to prevent fear from driving our beliefs, our actions, and our decisions. Really, we are most subject to fear when we don't see it. So making it visible, naming it, and so that we can consciously work with it rather than being at its mercy. So that's characteristic one, fear. And by the way, there is no order to these. This is just, as you'll see, they're all very much interconnected as well. Another characteristic of white supremacy culture we might think of as perfectionism, or the idea that there's one right way to do things. So perfectionism can be our tendency to focus on mistakes and to make them really personal, make them personal to ourselves or to others. It assumes that there is such a thing as perfect and that anything that is less than perfect, which is going to be pretty much everything, is a problem, right? So we tend to blame ourselves or blame others when we see a lack of perfect, when we are kind of stuck in this characteristic or in this mindset. And then paternalism shows up, when people with the most power are the ones who are determining the standards of what is good or what is perfect, and mostly making the decisions while marginalizing those with less power under the guise of what's in their best interest. So we have this notion of the one right way of doing things. We have the people in power who are determining what that right way is, and holding everyone to impossible standards. Antidotes for perfectionism: appreciating others, starting from that place of appreciating others rather than criticizing, depersonalizing mistakes and learning from them. There is an ethos called cultural humility, the idea of showing up and not knowing about other cultures, other paths, other ways of doing things, right? And really having that understanding that there might be many paths toward a solution or toward a way of producing something wonderful. And then, of course, in terms of the decisions that we make, making sure that we are acting inclusively so that the decisions we make can be informed by everyone and not from a top-down paternalistic standpoint. Another characteristic of white supremacy culture is the binary, either or. Either or. Binary thinking is what reduces this complexity of life and the nuance of our relationships with each other into either or, this or that, yes or no, right, wrong, with us, against us. It fosters zero-sum thinking, right? If I win, you lose. It spurs conflict. It reinforces urgency and that one right way perfectionistic thinking we were just talking about, as well as abuses of power. So we can start to see how these characteristics are really deeply interconnected with one another and mutually reinforcing. So this either or thinking is a strategy that's often used by people with a clear agenda or goal to push those who might be in the middle, still thinking or reflecting, to make this choice between A or B without acknowledging the existence of other options, right? Or need for time to reflect, maybe come up with more options. We might also see this show up in narratives or conversations about being a good person, for example, being a good white person, right? So by clinging to that category, we as white people might erase some of our own innate complexity and opportunities to learn, grow, to become better, right? We can see ourselves in progress along the continuum Mickey shared with us last month, to be much more skillful in terms of how we engage with this work. So antidotes to this oversimplified either or thinking: we can notice it when it comes up in language. We can notice when issues or situations are being oversimplified, boiled down to one cause or one solution, and really try to avoid that. We can work actively to create more than two options. The Buddhists talk about the middle way, right? So not this or that, but finding the middle way. What's the other option that's in the middle that might contain a bit more truth, a little bit more wisdom? And a really practical antidote here is not to make decisions under pressure. Slow down, take a breath, explore creative solutions that might address root causes rather than what is usually a surface level solution offered by this either or thinking. Closely related, we have denial and defensiveness. So here's a characteristic. It's also related back to fear, right? We defend ourselves because we're afraid of losing power or standing. We're afraid of losing face, losing comfort, losing privilege, or losing our own story of ourselves. So someone might defend themselves against the notion of white privilege because they grew up poor. So both defensiveness and denial also bring in that binary we just talked about. You know, I can't be racist because I'm a good person. It's either or, radically simplified. This denial and defensiveness is also at the core of white fragility, which Mickey talked about last month as well. She isn't with us this week, but in our discussions preparing for this section, Mickey invoked Colin Kaepernick's protests against police brutality and the fact that despite it being a completely peaceful protest, kneeling during the national anthem was deemed inappropriate by a majority white leadership of the NFL, the media, et cetera, as if that protest were more offensive than the racist police brutality it was meant to spotlight. So this we might see as a textbook example of tone policing, right? Attacking the style of a critique defensively in order to distract from the content, from the core issue at hand. So when defensiveness comes up, we can name it. We can also name it within ourselves. Okay, I'm feeling defensive right now. We can identify what am I defending against? What am I protecting against? And we can see how our defensiveness in particular works against our intentions. You know, it cuts us off from really showing up as the person that we want to be, engaged, connected, and active in dismantling racism. It's also important to notice power and privilege dynamics at play. So if you're in a position that has a lot of power or privilege, really noticing defensiveness come up and reminding yourself that there's probably a lot that you don't know here. There's probably a lot that you can learn. Speaking of learning, maybe our greatest barrier to learning comes from this next characteristic, the right to comfort. This is really the core belief that comfort is either our goal or our right. As you can see in the chart on the left here, that fear zone on the very inner part of the chart encompasses denial and avoidance and sameness for the sake of staying comfortable. So that anything that challenges us, including conflict, we will perceive as a threat to that comfort. And I think this can include all different kinds of conflict. Conflict with other people, the conflict of our stories with other people's stories, our perspective and other people's perspectives coming into conflict. So white supremacy culture tells us that conflict itself is the problem, and that anybody bringing up or pointing to a conflict is the source of the problem, right? Again, that distracting us from the legitimate issue that's at the heart of a conflict, making conflict the villain here. So comfort does not serve us in the ways that we might think it does. It can make us self-righteous, but it doesn't really make us right. But when we can step out of our comfort zone and find that our fears are largely unfounded or even manufactured by the system, we can really start to learn and grow. So the antidotes to this right to comfort and fear of conflict include really seeing and welcoming discomfort as the root of growth and learning. You know, we need to be uncomfortable if we are going to learn. We can deepen our understanding about these issues as a way to come to understand just how much we don't know. We can also really studiously practice not taking everything personally, not making everything about us and our own comfort. We can kind of at a next level welcome feedback and recognize that criticism won't kill us, but make us stronger, and make a plan for how to engage in conflict and hard conversations before they happen, really being intentional about creating space for those conversations. And when needed, we can invite mediation or counsel from a third party to help us move through these difficult moments together. I feel like this one could be its own session. Any of them could really. So I'll just say one more time that these concepts are very dense, very complex. They really deserve time and energy to properly understand and engage with them. We will share the link to the website and you can explore in your own time if you like. But individualism is really a big part of how this system perpetuates itself. It's about separating ourselves from one another. It's the notion that we can be successful on our own, that we are not a part of the groups that we belong to, right? White people in particular might believe this, that individual achievements are more important than the groups, that we might be more comfortable, there's that word again, working alone than collaborating with other people, right? Which might bring about some element of conflict or loss of comfort. And all of this tends to result in isolation and loneliness. The very feelings that, as we talked about a moment ago, are leveraged to manipulate people into that toxic sense of belonging according to race, particularly in white supremacy groups and ideologies. So antidotes to individualism, how do we start to shift from the me culture to the we culture as we see here on the right? Well, we can start to understand our dominant identities, you know, as a white person, understanding that as an identity and how it informs my thinking. We can do our personal work as an individual, but also look to bring focus to the cultural, institutional, and systemic manifestations of white supremacy so that it's not just us, but we are also addressing the system. We can name teamwork and collaboration as a value, particularly in our work, perhaps, professionally or in community. We can reward people for collaborating, make sure that that is a strategy that is appreciated and rewarded. And we can bring problems to the group and create collective accountability rather than assigning them to an individual and maybe blaming them when they aren't able to overcome it themselves. Another key element of white supremacy culture that we run into, particularly in our marketplace and in our financial systems, the beliefs that more is better, that there's never enough. These fall under the characteristic of quantity over quality, right? And our financial systems rely on and perpetuate this characteristic so innately, it almost seems like illogical or impossible to even challenge it. But if we can stop and look beyond this narrative that the culture feeds us, we can see that this is not sustainable, right? More is better is not sustainable for our planet, for us as people. There's no such thing as unlimited growth. And there is so much more that matters more. It just happens to be perhaps harder to measure, harder to quantify. I read recently, I think it was in the 1619 project, that the first known spreadsheets, the first known scientific management tools that tracked and measured productivity didn't actually come from the Industrial Revolution as we might have thought. They weren't from Henry Ford's era, but rather from plantation owners who used highly sophisticated accounting practices even more consistently than factories did. They were literally looking at human beings as capital after all. So these practices, which were intended to extract the greatest value at the lowest possible cost, still show up in our culture today in the corporate space in ways that I think are really still stressing and straining and oppressing the human beings in the system. So antidotes, we can be setting goals and performance metrics that are much more holistic and much more long-term versus short-term. We can include process goals in planning. So it's not just goals of achievement, but making sure that we're considering not only the ends, but also the means by which we are achieving our goals. We can distinguish between just simply getting more of something and really growing in sustainable ways and making meaningful progress toward our vision. And we can make sure that we are establishing and continually referencing value statements, whether in a community organization or in a corporation, to balance out this hunger for more. This is maybe the trickiest one, the worship of the written word. It's not about writing being a bad thing, just to be crystal clear. It's more about information being most valued when it's written or quote unquote official, right? It's about writing needing to be presented in a certain style. And if it's presented in that style, it's correct. It's taken as gospel, right? And unfortunately, this emphasis on the written word tends to erase the value and validity of all the other ways that we communicate, that we can share information, that we can generate information and absorb it together. So antidotes to this over-indexing on what's written down is working to understand how we process, share, and store information as human beings, and that there are different ways to do that. Recognizing the contributions and skills that different people bring to the organization, not just being a skilled writer, but also, different ways of thinking. Making sure that we're developing and cultivating our listening skills so that we can engage with people on a human level and not just through documents. And making sure that our language, whether spoken or written, can be clearly understood by everyone without jargon, buzzwords, etc., confusing or obscuring information in writing. This is our last characteristic, and it's a big one, this pervasive sense of urgency in white supremacy culture. So this doesn't refer to actual emergencies, just to be clear, where immediate action is required to save lives. It's about applying that sense of urgency to everything, everywhere, all the time. You know, if everything is always urgent, we are always reacting. We are always in fear mode. We never feel we have the time to stop, breathe, reflect, connect, go deeper into the roots of our systemic issues. We're always firefighting. We're not building creative, constructive solutions for a better world. So the antidotes here differentiate between a true urgency and a false manufactured sense of urgency, like this chart here invites us to do. We can also understand that pretty much everything takes longer than anybody expects. So planning for that and really creating time and space to do our work, whatever it is, in a thoughtful way. Making sure that work plans are created based on the lived experience of the people or organizations involved, not what the paternalistic leadership on high thinks it should take. Planning for how to make good decisions when we are confronted with real urgency can serve us in those moments. And very simply, deliberately pausing in response to urgency. Feeling that sense of we have to do this right now, and giving ourselves a moment to pause and interrogate that sense and see what it's made of. Wow, that was a really fast spin through these characteristics. Each and every one of them could be a full 2-hour session, without a doubt. So to bring all of this together and to hear your thoughts and experiences with any one or more of these, we're going to break into small groups and reflect on our own experiences. Okay, welcome back everyone from breakouts. I think Barbara was in group 1, if I'm not mistaken. So Barbara, would you like to go first and read out some of the insights from your group?
Sure. Well, one of the main ones, I think several people struggled with coming up with, and maybe it required more thought, but some people asked for more examples of these issues, of these types of white supremacist characteristics would have been more helpful. They couldn't, and another point was unteasing all that stuff that we take so much for granted, but actually being able to see it. And maybe they need a little more direction on maybe how to actually see it or tease it out. But some people, several people selected perfectionism, and others focus more on like, the written world and the style type thing. But then also individualism is a very Western type of concept, and so I wouldn't be surprised that it was involved in white supremacy, the idea of picking yourself up by the bootstraps or being, I'm sorry, as you might know also, is that individualism is a form, or is considered by many psychologists as the highest form of mental health, which is not necessarily the case, but that's what we have been taught as a psychologist. That's what we've taught. That's how you identify somebody who's perfectly mentally healthy. So that's pretty much what we spoke about. But I think the need for more examples would have been a little bit helpful to some people.
Yeah. Thank you for that feedback. I will absolutely encourage you, if you are looking for more nuance, if you're looking for more real life examples, to visit the White Supremacy Culture website. It's really, I think, beautifully put together, very rich in terms of those examples. And she certainly gets into depths that we are not able to in this space. So we will certainly share that link. It'll be a very easy Google if you're looking for that right away. I think we were group 2, if I remember correctly. So the characteristics that spoke most to our group were the either or binary. In particular, one of our breakout group members talked about growing up, you're either beautiful or you're not, and beauty being defined as predominantly white or light-skinned characteristics. And so that, either or coming into play. Lots of thinking around and observations around denial and defensiveness. Individualism definitely came up, as well as right to comfort, and particularly white men in leadership roles needing to, maybe keep themselves at a distance from some criticism coming their way. Who was group 3's lead?
Right here.
Thank you, Judith.
There was so much said, but I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible. One participant in my group talked about having been raised in a town where there aren't too many people of color. And he said fear particularly resonated with him only because he didn't have the exposure to anyone else, to any minority. So that made it easier for him to sustain the differences that exist culturally. Also, what was mentioned by someone else was how many people who consider themselves to be liberals, and yet when it comes to racism, it's intellectualized. They don't really necessarily apply the concept of mixing with anyone else. They get comfortable being with people that look and think just like they do. So again, the word easy to just stay as it is, stay to hang out with friends, to socialize with those that look like themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Judy?
Yes, in our group, the worship of the written word really resonated with one member who writes as part of their career, and how the emphasis on perfectionism, and whoever writes the most clever grant is the one who wins the grant, despite the organization's value or anything, and that it's highly competitive, and it's the writing that gets wins the grant. It was my understanding. Another person involved in academia and corporate publishing also talked about the importance of quantity, urgency, and making money. That person spoke about the racism in academia, and that the publishing companies only allow certain kinds of books to be published, thereby maintaining this similar white supremacy perspective and not getting other voices heard. One person, what resonated with them was the fear and defensiveness, and talked about the dynamic between women of color and white women, and how the defensiveness of white women creates tension in the women of color, so that there's this dynamic going underneath whatever content is about everyone being protective and guarding themselves. And then an interesting point of view was that what was missing this list is this sense of superiority over the other that's pervades white supremacy, and that it's absent in this list, and that it's such a major factor. And we explored that together in a little bit of a discussion about how that impacts this person.
Thank you. I think that was all of our breakouts, right, Audrey? So let's take a break. Would people be okay with a 3-minute break just to come back at 4:20 Eastern? So just okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm going to go back into screen share mode, and we will move into our last section. So Clyde was in my breakout group, and he brought this up as another characteristic that I agree is missing from the white supremacy culture list, just like the one that Judy just brought up. So this is, the just the way it is, right? Really maintaining the status quo at all costs. And there are a number of ways that we do that. But this also invokes an implicit bias that we have as human beings. So it's something that is cultural, but it's also something that occurs and manifests quite naturally within us. And that's a status quo bias, our tendency to resist change and to prefer what's even a negative present status over the future that might be different and is unknown. So this feels like a good transition into a conversation around bias and implicit bias. So if white supremacy culture is the water we're swimming in, what is going on within us that is maybe also exacerbating or reinforcing white supremacy? So let's talk about bias. What is bias? Bias, we can think of it as a shortcut in our automated processing of information. Bias is our brain's way of solving the many cognitive problems that we face, which we're going to talk about what those are, while simultaneously saving energy, which is the brain's most precious resource. So the brain is trying to do a lot of computing while expending the lowest amount of energy possible. And that is why we have these shortcuts of bias in our thinking. Who has bias? Everybody. If you have a brain that is fully functional, you have biases in your processing. It is part of being a human being. So normalizing that, as we'll see, I think can be a step in the right direction. So what are some of these cognitive problems that the brain is trying to solve? The first one is that there is just too much information in the world. There is so much out there, particularly now, oh my gosh, with the internet and everything. But for all of human history, there's been more information than we can take in. So we have no choice but to filter out almost all of it. Never mind that some of the information we filter out is actually really useful and important to us to make decisions. In the case of confirmation bias, for example, we will seek out and notice and retain information that validates our own existing views and beliefs. And the negativity bias that you see here, right, is about focusing on what's wrong in an attempt to protect ourselves, always kind of scanning for what's wrong and what we need to defend ourselves against, right? We're going to see these biases kind of looping into a systemic relationship with some of those culture characteristics we were just talking about. We also have self-defense behind our bias blind spot, or the fact that many of us think that we are less biased than we actually are. So that's problem one, too much information, but bias means we don't see everything. Problem number two, bias is trying to help us make meaning of our vast world, right? Constructing a narrative to help us navigate the infinite complexity of life. But sometimes we will construct meaning that is not actually there. We will just make things up, right? We will find patterns in the sparsest of data. We do it every time we read our horoscope, right? But we also do this when we reflect back on situations that have already happened and we imagine ourselves back then knowing everything that we know now. This can obstruct our ability to learn. It's called hindsight bias. One of my new favorite biases I recently learned about is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which means that people with low ability or expertise or experience with a certain issue or area of knowledge tend to really overestimate their ability or knowledge in that area. And those who know more about this area tend to be aware of what they don't know, and they think that they don't know enough. So I see this having a lot of implications around anti-racist awareness. So people who have very little awareness of racism being very confident that they know what they need to know and, disregarding the issue. And then people with more awareness sometimes thinking they don't know enough to speak confidently or effectively or act effectively around it. And then we apply this constructive meaning, this making things up to people. Our brains automatically, before we're consciously aware of it, will sort people into categories of in-group and out-group, right? Who are my people? And then who's everybody else? So we do this instinctively based on surface level information or circumstantial information. And then in moments of conflict or crisis, we give these associations way too much power. Problem number 3 is a need to act fast, right? Our brain is wired to act as quickly as possible in the face of uncertainty. Remember that culture of urgency we talked about, right? So that characteristic can feed into this tendency that our brains have to really try to make decisions as quickly as possible. So to help us do this, our brain jumps to conclusions, which are often inherently unfair or self-serving and counterproductive. So to start with, we have affinity bias. Many of us are familiar with this one already. This is where we like the people who we think are like us. Very simple, right? Fundamental attribution error is a little bit less known, but I think it's a big one to understand. That's when we define who someone is by something they've done. So for example, somebody cuts you off in traffic, they're a jerk, right? Obviously, they're a terrible person. Or if someone makes a simple mistake, we're all too quick to question their competence, right? Or maybe their character, depending on the nature of the mistake. So we can see how harmful this is, particularly when it compounds with the last bias that's listed here, groupthink, right? The tendency of groups to align to one way of thinking or one presumption, rather than challenge each other to really think more openly, to think more critically. So all of these are strategies that we have for acting fast and making quick decisions. The fourth and final problem that bias tries to help us with, that we'll talk about today, is to try to remember what really matters. So we can only afford to keep around so much information, right? And only really what is going to prove useful to us in the future. So our brains will edit down and reinforce some memories after the fact to help us really remember what the brain thinks is going to be most useful. We will then discard specifics and form generalities that are simple to retain. But when those generalities reinforce errors, as in the case of stereotyping, we have these general assumptions that tell us that all people of this type are like this, right? And then prejudice is our automatic judgment of people beforehand based on some aspect of their personhood, usually based in stereotypes. So this is a very quick review of a number of the different biases that are part of our programming. They are part of how we are wired. And unless we're really paying attention to our biases and taking every opportunity to disrupt this very automatic, rapid processing in our brains, we're likely to spend most of our time looking for validation of our own views through confirmation bias. We're likely to be stereotyping others. We're likely to hire and befriend people who remind us of ourselves. We're likely to be the heroes of our own stories. You know, that's just how we're wired. And we all do it, not because we're, quote, bad people. Let's watch out for that either or binary, but because we're human beings with brains that work. So I'd love to share with you this video that will help us bring some of this together. This is kind of a public service announcement and an experiment all together. Let's see what we experience when we watch this. Okay, yes, that was a Procter & Gamble ad that is intended to shine a light on bias. And we're about to break out into groups one last time, but and we can talk about our responses to that video, whatever they were. But before we do, we don't want to leave you hanging. We have some strategies we'd like to offer for how to mitigate our own implicit race bias in particular, since we know it is something that lives within us. We can start by slowing down. This has been a theme we've been talking about all day. Slowing down to make space for mindful decisions, right? Really resisting that urgency and instead giving ourselves time. We can notice our bias response in the body. This goes back to actually one of our group agreements, staying embodied and noticing, when do we tighten in response to someone who's maybe walking down the street toward us, right? When do we feel that tension that was just mentioned a moment ago, when we're in relationship with somebody that we feel maybe some unfounded assumption around in terms of our relationship? We can notice the bias response in our bodies. It is a protective mechanism a lot of the time. So seeing that response physically can help us to disrupt it. A little strategy called the flip test is one I use a lot. If I find myself in a situation with a person where I'm having a challenge interpersonally, I will take some element of that person's identity and flip it to the other identity. So if I'm dealing with a woman, I might ask how I would deal with the situation if they were a man. If I'm dealing with a Black person, I might say, okay, how would I address the situation if this person was white? You know, and it's a really easy way for me to check myself and my assumptions and make sure that I am engaging from a place of true openness and humanity. Which brings me to the last one here. There are many different ways that we can rehumanize one another. Bias wants to flatten people into concepts, right? Into ideas, but we need to remember that one another are fully whole, complex people. So we can do this by consciously individuating, making sure that we're not seeing a person as a representative of a category, but as an individual person themselves. We can get curious about who they are and all of their complexity. We can practice compassion and care, and we can also practice perspective taking, looking at life, looking at a situation from someone else's perspective can help us to really flesh out and rehumanize our understanding of the situation that we are in. So in terms of mitigating our own bias, these are some simple strategies. When it comes to working with others, perhaps in the community, or for those of us who work in the media, or for those of us who work in companies or other forms of collective, here are some of the ways we can mitigate biases that will naturally emerge in collective settings. We can work to increase contact and relationship between people of different races. You know, just as Audrey is so intentional about creating racially diverse breakout groups, right? It's as simple as that, making sure that we are connecting with one another. If we are presenting narratives or stories or perspectives, if we're hosting a panel, making sure that we are counter-programming, right, against stereotypes, making sure that the imaging that we represent in our materials and in our leadership as well, in terms of identity, are working against stereotypes. Partnership building, a great example of this one is in healthcare settings. So doctors that are really working to mitigate their implicit bias are encouraged to see their relationship with their patients not as a kind of top-down expert to patient relationship, but as a partnership, as an interaction or as a collaboration of equals, right? Recognizing that the patient brings a lot of information, a lot of their own data, their own expertise about their lives, as well as their cultures, for the doctor to learn from and benefit from in this partnership as well. And finally, it is important that we continue to normalize bias and really name it when we see it and when it's at work. We can do this for ourselves, and we can also call in others who might be making decisions or otherwise acting from a place of bias, so that we can build awareness and build relationship So calling in as an alternative to calling out as a strategy. All right. Audrey, do you think we have time for a report back? Yeah, okay. Barbara, would you like to kick us off? We can't hear you, Barbara. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I wasn't muted before. At any rate, we all came up with different, ways. A lot of them weren't racist, but they were still very interesting. Like, for instance, someone said that, they were aware of thinking that everyone with a thick Southern accent was not very bright. Of course, they're trying to get rid of that thought. Everyone drives a pickup truck is a Trump supporter. Certain places or states, they're thinking of them as MAGA states. One thing that happened to someone was that they went to pick something up about a game between Orange and let me just say it happened to me, between Orange and Maplewood. And I'm in Maplewood, picking this up in Maplewood, and the person asked me, "Oh, did you go to Orange High School?" Instead of, could easily have picked Maplewood. And in certain places, some people have suggested that maybe Black people can afford to live in Soma, which is another bias as well. So those are most, what other bias? Some people, as far as trying to get rid of their biases, to getting to know people, meeting them and recognizing that we're all 99% have the same DNA. So that the differences are so minor, and we're making such a big difference out of something so little. So that's it, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. In group 2, some of the strategies that people spoke to were that slowing down, trying to be mindful of responses that come up in the first moment of bias presenting itself and trying to disrupt that. Strategies of, for example, when in hiring positions, doing blind resumes or resumes without identifying details, and also making sure to take out requirements around higher education, for example, in order to mitigate bias around educational access. And there was also some voicing of some, I think, I'll do my best to represent it, I think some pain around depictions and discussions of very real experiences with racism in the world, and perhaps some unskillfulness on my part as a facilitator in terms of inviting voices into the room. Judith, group 3.
Yes. Affinity biases were mentioned in my group. Someone said they realize how limiting those are in terms of giving themselves a chance to meet others and get to know people of color. There was also someone who said they're very conscious of how their biases and when they show up, and that whenever those biases come up to the surface, they make sure that they consciously do their best in correcting them, in addressing them. Someone also mentioned that in their very school, there are many students that they've witnessed, children of color are expected to misbehave. So they've said that definitely is something that they see quite often in the school system where they work. I think that's basically it. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. And Judy.
Yeah, a lot of the majority of the people in the group really spoke to how much awareness combined with anti-racism education was really helping them becoming more and more conscious of thoughts, sensations in the body, reactivity, and not acting on that. There was also an effort to overcome biases by reaching out, read literature from other cultures, choose physicians who are Black, like really going beyond your the comfortable zone. Another person talked about a strengths-based approach in working with other like schools or organizations, rather than looking at the deficits, really focusing on what's strong and working in a much more collaborative fashion versus we're the experts coming in and we'll fix this problem. Yeah, a lot about educating oneself and becoming aware of what, when you're looking at something or interacting with something that is creating biases, and speaking up.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for participating in a lot of discussion today. We really wanted to give lots of time for connection and reflection. Audrey, do you want to do the post survey before we have our wrap up?
Absolutely. You will see a poll coming up on your screen. Please scroll down. There are actually 8 different indices that we're asking you to weigh in on. You should see them now. Just answer your honest, best assessment of where you are, no right or wrong answer, and scroll down to the next question for a total of 8. I will see on my end how many of you are actually completing. At the end of it, however, we will not share the results because this is for our benefit to understand how well we are communicating this information to you from the pre-survey to this post-survey for this segment.
I'm having trouble. I see the questions when there's nothing to click on to answer it.
You should be able to just click on the actual.
I'm clicking on the answer. I don't know if anybody else is having this issue. Oh, now it's gone.
You may not have been, like, I can't answer
Oh, maybe
it either.
I was
Maybe
kept
considered,
off.
yeah,
Yeah.
one of the
Sorry.
coalition people.
I
Okay.
did not block anyone. That was not our intention. So I'm starting, 12 of the 18 people have finished. So we're waiting for the remaining 6 of you. And then we're
Audrey,
going to go back.
Audrey, I have the option to respond, but I obviously am not going to.
Would you prefer not to?
Yeah, so yeah, just so you can count me out as one of the non-responders.
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to answer the first one.
Okay, we only have
So
4
I'm
more
not
people.
answering this.
And so in a minute, I'm going to close. And those who can answer, please do. And we're going to move on and hand it back to Kristen. I see people's eyes still down on their screen. I'm going to assume that they're still reading through. When you finish, if you'll just look up, I can. All righty. And a few of you have your screens blank. We're going to two more people here. And I don't know if that's you, Kristen, one of the 2.
One of them is probably me.
Yeah, we couldn't do it. This is Joel and Melody. The submit was grayed out and we couldn't press it. And
I'm sorry about that, Joel and Melody. Okay,
Yeah.
then I'm going to end the poll and thank
Yeah.
all of you for helping us to get some indication of how well this has worked for you. And I'm giving it back to Kristen now.
Okay, so just a very quick wrap up so we can get everybody out on time. We'd love to know something that we can see from one another in the chat. If you'll open up the chat and share to the group one idea or insight or action that has resonated with you that you're taking away from today's session. It's always nice for us to have an opportunity to lock in a learning that we can take with us. So that's an invitation on our way out. We will be sharing these links with you, including the link to the White Supremacy Culture website by Tima Oken and her network of colleagues and contributors. The Harvard Implicit Association Test. So you can actually test your own implicit biases if you'd like to online through that test. The Inner Work of Racial Justice is a beautiful book by Rhonda V. McGee, who is a lawyer. And she wrote about how to apply mindfulness practices to anti-racism in terms of our inner work and our work in the community. And Blind Spot, The Hidden Biases of Good People is a book that goes deeper into biases if you are interested in that. We so appreciate your time, your energy, and your attention being with us today. Our next session, as I believe you've been notified by email, is going to not be in 2 weeks, but it's actually going to be next week because we are working around the Easter holiday. And Barbara will be taking us through a month of content, really rich content around the impact of white supremacy on people of color and on our nation. So I will just leave you with this quote from Tima Oken, who said, "The good news is that while white supremacy culture informs us, it does not define us. It is a construct. Anything constructed can be deconstructed and replaced. Given how others have shown us the way, the good news is that we can and must be equally brave, bold, and fierce ancestors for those who come with and after us." Thank you again all for your partnership and your contributions to this community and this work. Thank you.
Please continue to add your takeaways to the chat. We'd love to know. And enjoy the rest of your Sunday.